Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Sometimes in our practice, we can have very high ideals, and these high ideals are very valuable. They give very clear sense as to the direction that we should be going in our practice. A sense of where we hoped that this spiritual life will lead us in our own understanding. Gives us a sense of motivation, inspiration. And yet we also come up across this conundrum that sometimes when we kind of get down to work and actually do the practice, it can be just extraordinarily challenging sometimes. And it's sometimes it's very easy to get into these states of comparing ourselves to the ideal. And the ideal is so magnificent, so beautiful, so perfect, and we can look at our own practice or even just like where things are at the present moment, and it can be very frustrating and disappointing, and we can sometimes get into states of negativity and even despair, feeling that we're just so far away from this ideal. And to a certain extent, this is almost inevitable for people who are new to these ideals, to the ideal of, say, freedom from greed, hatred, and delusion. When you first come across it, you don't know how difficult it is. You don't really know what's involved. And you hear that to renounce greed, to renounce ill will, to renounce laziness, this is a path that leads us to what the Buddha calls the highest happiness. And it's just, you first come across that and you think, oh, wonderful, that's fantastic, that's what I'm looking for, something with substance, clear path, based on causality. Let's take this teaching, let's get to work. And you begin, and it doesn't take many hours usually before you kind of hit the wall, and you're suddenly starting to doubt. We've told the story before. It was this very, very amusing story, and I won't be able to do it justice. I was the guest monk at Nanachat. This is many years ago. And I remember receiving this letter, this person from America. He wanted to come, and he was totally committed. He was totally inspired. He was just kind of finishing selling everything, get everything tidied up, and he's going to come, and he's going to ordain for life. And I just, this is interesting. This is a pretty full-on letter. And I remember looking at the letter and responding something like, well, everything's uncertain, and you're welcome to come and see what you think and so forth. But, don't make any kind of lifelong decisions at this point until you've been here at least. And then I remember he shows up, and I'm sitting in the back in the office, and I'm sitting at the computer there. This is maybe 10, 12, 14, 12 years ago maybe. And this person shows up, and it was like maybe 10 o'clock in the morning, and he shows up, and he's still in the same mood. Like he's young, he's totally inspired, and he's really convinced that he's going to be going forth for life, and he's kind of gotten rid of everything he owned, and he's ready to go. And he wanted to know where his hut would be and so forth. And I said, well, actually, I'm a bit busy right now. Maybe if you could just like go to the sala and just do some meditating for a while and come back and see me in about an hour, and I can sort out the plans and tell you where to go. And so he goes and he does some meditation. He comes back and he comes into the back of the office, and I say, well, okay, so should we get going? And he looks at me and says, well, actually, I think I've changed my mind. And I go, you've changed your mind? I go, what happened? You were really determined just not that long ago. And he says, well, I know this is going to sound strange, but I've really loved donuts. I really love donuts, and I can't. I've got to go get a donut. And I said, well, fine, that's fine by me. But I hope you've kind of learned a lesson from this or something. And I can't remember what I said. I just it was quite, like I said, I can't do it justice. It was absolutely. It couldn't have been more. It could have been an act from a Saturday Night Live skit. Anyways, a bit of a sidetrack there. The point is, we have these ideals, and they sound so wonderful. I remember another monk. This was a novice, a Canadian novice, an older man. He was in his 60s, I think, when he got to the monastery, or late 50s, anyways. And I have a really fond memory of him. He was older, and he very gentle and incredibly sincere, and very slow and methodical and patient kind of person, and very gentle. And after he was there for a year, and I remember he was sewing his Sangati, actually. I remember it took him a month to sew his Sangati, and it was a perfectly sewn Sangati, but he did it so slow and so methodical. And he just before his ordination date, he actually decided he wasn't going to ordain. And he was frustrated with himself, but he was sharing just his memories of. He had a house in Kitimat, BC, and he just remembers sitting in his little home, and he'd make himself a cup of tea, and the tea, he'd get high on this tea. He said to me, he's a very kind of sensitive guy. Get high on this tea, and he'd be reading these Ajahn Chah books, and he'd be so inspired, living out in the forest, in the jungle, and kind of fighting with the defilements, and then you get out there, and it's nowhere near as romantic as it seemed, and it was actually very challenging, and in the end he felt it wasn't for him. Last week, or last Saturday, I guess it was, Ajahn Sanyamo gave a talk, and he made reference to a teaching that's in the suttas, and he just quoted it so quickly. I'm not sure if people noticed that it's a beautiful teaching, and it was actually the word of the Buddha. And I will quote the original passage. Ajahn Sanyamo just paraphrased it, and I'll just see if I can kind of quote it. The Buddha says, "Monks, abandon what is unwholesome." He goes, "It is possible, monks, to abandon that which is unwholesome. If it were not possible to abandon the unwholesome, I would not ask you to abandon it. But since it is possible to abandon the unwholesome, therefore I ask that you abandon the unwholesome." And then he says, subsequently after that, he says, "Monks, abandon the unwholesome. Abandoning the unwholesome leads to your welfare and happiness. If abandoning the unwholesome were to lead to your harm and suffering, I would not ask you to abandon it. But since, monks, abandoning the unwholesome leads to your welfare and happiness, therefore I ask you to abandon it." And then he says the same thing with cultivating the wholesome. And this is kind of a very profound thing, I think. One of the powers of the Tathagata, which we've kind of taught here before, the Buddha says there's 10 powers of the Buddha. And one of them just seems kind of so unassuming. He says, a Tathagata, a Buddha, he knows that which is possible as being possible, and he knows what is impossible as being impossible. And that's it. That's one of the powers of the Tathagata. And it's easy just to read that and kind of think, yeah, okay, whatever. So he knows what's possible and what's not. But kind of buried within that statement is the implication that most of us don't understand what is possible and what is not possible. Or in other words, to understand actually what is possible is a power of a Buddha. This is no small thing. And how often is it that we're in our practice and we hit these walls where we feel something is impossible, it can't be done. and we just feel stuck, and we despair. So I think this is something worth thinking about, and you might think to yourself, yeah, okay, maybe it's possible to abandon the unwholesome, but maybe the Buddha wasn't referring to me. Maybe he was referring to some other monk, or maybe it's like other kinds of unwholesomeness can be abandoned, but not the kind that I'm stuck with. And I think that's missing the point. This is a natural response, I think, but missing the point. And this is something I remember giving a talk about a long time ago, but maybe I'll revisit it here. Just how destructive this, like, assuming one's inability to do things is around anything, let alone not just spiritual practice, but especially with regards to spiritual practice. If you get into this negative state where it's like something can't be done, or it's sort of like this train of thought. If you think of thought as being just a flow, and it's going from an image just comes to mind like a frog jumping from a rock to a rock to a rock on a stream. It's like thought just going from one thought to another. And negativity is like something that just weighs down the thought. It biases the thinking process, always pulling it in one direction. And sometimes I think, or certainly myself, you don't even notice it. You're not even aware that negativity is somehow guiding the whole process. It's biasing everything. It's like a pair of glasses that is coloring everything the whole thinking process and the whole process of association that goes on in the mind is biased to be towards assuming. Even with people who maybe are overconfident in other areas, when it comes to spiritual practice, we can sometimes start assuming we can't do it, or it's not doable, or it's too difficult, or it's not worth it, or something like that. And rather than trying to change this directly and trying to notice where you're being negative and then kind of trying not to be negative, what I recommend, or what I'd like to encourage as an experiment, is just starting with the determination, okay, I don't know about my thinking process, the process of logic, which maybe I think I'm thinking logical, rational, but let me just do this. Let me start with a totally unconditional positive assumption about the future, about my life. And forget about whether or not my rational side says it's reasonable, it's logical, or it's kind of being completely hokey or wishful thinking or whatever. Let me just start with this. Let me say, okay, I'm going to proceed here with a totally positive approach. And not just positive in the sense of, it's going to be fun from here on in, but I can do this. I can do I can abandon the unwholesome. And I can cultivate the wholesome. And it is possible for me to do this, and B, it is going to lead to my welfare. It's actually going to lead to happiness. And so just to start, have that being your starting point with whatever it is that we get stuck with again and again and again. And you might think, well, but that's really not realistic. I mean, this is let's say you've got a problem or an addiction that's been with you for 50 years. Well, that's fair enough, but all I'm saying is that rather than the usual way of thinking, I'm just trying to point out how the negative way of thinking serves no purpose. It's almost always disadvantageous. It's almost always unhelpful to whatever it is we're trying to accomplish. And the positive way of thinking, I'm not necessarily saying being optimistic, because you might think of optimism and pessimism as being two extremes. And what we are in the Dhamma is just kind of a clear sense of, well, I'm not optimistic, I'm not pessimistic, but it can be done. I'm positive. I feel positive about that. And I guess it's different from optimism in the sense that optimism is kind of a more, there's some future state that you're looking forward to getting. And what I'm pointing to is not necessarily something like that. It's almost like saying, I have no idea how this is going to pan out, but I trust it's going to be, by cultivating the wholesome, abandoning the unwholesome, I'm going to be moving in the right direction. And then what you do, when you start with that perspective, you make this determination, that's where I'll start with. What does that feel like to be positive? Try and remember that. There must have been times in your life where you've been positive about something, like in a good attitude towards something. What does that feel like? Bring that up. And as you proceed to contemplate your situation, your life, your habits, the things that you need to do, the things that ought to be done, it's almost like starting with this positive step. It's like a light that then any negativity that is within you, kind of lurking and kind of biasing, kind of weighing the scales towards negativity, becomes much more apparent. And you might think, oh, wait a minute, I'm just drawing these certain conclusions out of a habit of negativity. And if I just drop that and have like this kind of trusting, positive attitude towards practice, many of the things that were previously obstacles just simply vanish. Because it's a very positive, the mind, this kind of positive attitude is very bright. It's calm. Again, because I'm not talking about any kind of we're not talking about being optimistic about winning something or kind of getting anything, but just this trust that things are going to be all right. Really, deeply, truly, things are going to be all right. And that's our trust. That's our trust in the Dhamma. And again, it's not a naive trust. It's not that this is a trust based on simply wishful thinking or just positive thinking, sort of from a think pink kind of attitude. It's actually based on the fact that we're Buddhists. We're in touch with the teachings. We've encountered the teachings. We've got a community. We've got the opportunity. We've got situations where we can practice. We've got the encouragement. We've got the mental health, to put forth efforts in this area. And where it is that we have to put forth effort, that's something that everyone has to, it's a very basic path of we all come back to, say, starting with generosity, for instance. Generosity as a foundation for relationships. Where there's generosity, there's this kind of open, free relating between two people or one person and a group of people. When you're generous to a loved one, a family member, sibling, somebody in the community, it means engaging with that person and opening your heart and giving something to that person. And not expecting anything in return. You're not expecting gratitude. You're not expecting... You just want to give. You want to see that other person have something. And it might be something material. It might be just a sense of... You might want that person to feel recognized. You might want that person to feel safe. There's so many different ways that we can give. And it's certainly not just on the material level. On the material level, it may often be a means to a person. This is one way to make a person feel recognized. I remember just something that struck me. I was so touched by this when I was a junior. Actually, I think I was in Anagarika. And Ajahn Jayasaro was working on the book Upalamani under the Tera's kuti. He was just a Tera at the time, like 11 pansas or something. Or no, it couldn't be 11 pansas. Anyways, he was a very junior, he wasn't such a senior monk, and someone asked me to bring a tea over to him. And I brought this tea, and to me he was like, just a step down from God. I really kind of idealized Ajahn Yatiko at the time, and I kind of have this tea, and I'm walking over, and he's under his kuti. It's maybe like 2 p.m, and I've got this tea. It's on a tray, and I'm wearing white. I'm just an anagarika, and he's on a desk under this hut, and there's these pictures that he's kind of working with. This is before the days of computers, and he's just designing each page, kind of taping pictures to the page and little cutouts, and it's kind of almost a mess on the table. And I bring this drink to him, and he goes, "Oh," he goes, "Brad." He goes, "Well," he goes, "Thank you very much." And he says, "Wait a minute," and he reaches into the desk and he pulls out a chocolate bar, and he just gives me this chocolate bar. And I was so moved actually by this, and not really because I could care less about the chocolate, even though I did care less about the chocolate, but it was just the fact that he kind of, that he used that chocolate as a way of acknowledging me. So it was very generous on his part, and I felt very honored, and that actually that meant I was very inspired by that. And it helped. One of the results of that was when I listened to his talks, I listened with that much more attention, because it was like, oh, he was generous in this way to just an anagarika. And those people who know Ajahn Yatiko, this is definitely one of his strong points. He's an extremely thoughtful person. And then there's appreciation, giving appreciation. Now we don't, when you give something to somebody, ideally, you don't do it because you want to be appreciated. And we have to, say in a community like this, we do whatever goodness that we do, we have to the extent that we can, we do it because it's the right thing to do. It's the good thing, it's a beautiful thing, it's worthwhile. And then if we get appreciated for it, well, fine. If we get criticized for it, that's fine. Basically we're doing it because we trust it's a good thing to do. But giving appreciation is also an important part of a relationship. First you have to notice the goodness that's in your life. So on the one hand, when you have, say, if you have a spouse or a family member, you actually have to think to yourself, what can I do for that family member? What is there anything that I can do from time to time that's unexpected? Just here, this is for you, an offering. And by the same token, you have to notice, or it's a good thing to do, to practice to notice when goodness is done to you, and notice that, and then you appreciate it, and you express that appreciation. And that way there's this free flow of energy, of giving, of give and take. In the Sangha, we get together formally as a group to actually share, kind of go around in a circle, kind of pointing out the things that we appreciate about the Sangha. And that's an important thing to do, because it even though sometimes I think people can feel, it's like, oh, here we go again, and it's often it's the same. It's kind of, I appreciate the lay crew. This often comes up, the lay people who are supporting us, and I appreciate this monk and that monk for doing this and that. But it shows that that there's that appreciation there. How many times are you in a relationship with, say you have a partner or something, and one complains, you never say that you love me, and then the other says, oh, but I love you. It's, I don't have to say that. And I remember this growing up, and people aren't mind readers, and that's why this ability to communicate and express appreciation for the goodness that's around you. It's part of a healthy family dynamic or community dynamic. And that's hard, expressing appreciation or giving. Giving is hard, and sometimes if you are somebody who, let's say you have really a heart which isn't used to giving at all, it can be really challenging. You have something that's kind of special, and you want to give it to somebody, but then part of you is scared because it's like, well, you feel secure with this, and you like this, and you want it for yourself. And you can easily slip into, oh, I can't, and just not do battle with yourself, and just say, no, I'm not going to give it, and then keep it. And this is a time when it's like, okay, rather than trying to force yourself to give, turn around and say, okay, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to be positive. Rather than assuming I'm going to fail yet again at kind of trying to give or doing something good, I'm going to be positive, and I'm going to say, you know, I can do this. And that just you'll find sometimes, at least, perhaps often, perhaps usually, it'll just open up the gates. And you'll find that whereas before you were afraid to give, now you feel that it's something that you can do. Same applies with the precepts. I have tremendous sympathy. In fact, I'm sure all practitioners have sympathy for addicts, because we're all addicts in our own way with different things. And to be addicted to something and to feel again and again that, say, to have tried to stop drinking or doing drugs or something like that, and to have failed, the heart, you really feel, I feel a lot of sympathy for that, and I can imagine very easily what that might be like, or I can imagine what it might be like for me. And I'm not suggesting that it's as easy as simply having a positive attitude, that will somehow enable one to free oneself from addictions or from habitual breaking of the precepts. But I will say this, it won't harm, it won't hurt. That when it comes time again to basically recognize, breaking these precepts, it's got to change. If you find yourself addicted, say, to stealing, this is something that it's got to change. Between now and enlightenment, eventually this has to change. This has to be abandoned. Or, say, being dishonest with your partner, this has to change. This has to change. And rather than getting negative about yourself, down on yourself, and criticize yourself for all the times you failed, try and entertain a positive attitude towards the whole challenge. This is something that can be done. And just if you can kind of imagine it, even if you just have to try and use your imagination and get into that mind state of what it might be like to be positive about one of these battles, these moral battles that we have, it's a great skillful means. And then also samadhi, just calming the mind. This can be quite common, how we can feel kind of frustrated, despairing, the mind just is never going to settle down. And if you can, this is actually great, because if you can cultivate just for a moment a sense of, this can be done, I can do this. Just that positive attitude in itself is so refreshing and such a relief. It just brings up a sense of happiness. And the Buddha says very clearly, this is, in terms of causality, the conditions that give rise to samadhi, the preceding condition that gives rise to samadhi, the Buddha says, is happiness. And so that's a very wonderful thing. And this is something you can clearly experience if you use your imagination, bring up a sense of what would it feel like to be actually positive for a few minutes about my practice. Just imagine, even if you feel totally negative and it's totally hopeless, we'll just say, just for the fun of it, what would it be like if you were positive? And the answer is usually, man, it would be so wonderful. And so many positive feelings and kind of uplifting feelings kind of come up. And you can use that like a wave that kind of can bring the mind to a sense of stillness and peace. And we, carrying on with the path, if we think of path as being this kind of very simplified vision of it, like say it's dana, so generosity, morality, mental stability, and then investigation. And when you start getting into investigation, for me anyways, positive or negative being positive or negative doesn't come into it, because it's so much about basically whatever you're experiencing. You step back from it, and you dissect it, and you look at it, and you see how it's come and how it's gone, how it goes, how it changes. You see how you don't have any control over it. It's got its own rhythm, its own momentum. Whether it's the body, you can see how the body, it's born and it dies. It's like two sides of the same coin. People want to live and they don't want to die. And somehow once we're born, we manage to convince ourselves that we're going to take birth but not death. And we have to see this, we have to investigate this over and over and see how birth and death are just absolutely one and the same. They're absolutely, you don't get one without the other. So we see the body, it's got this momentum, this movement. We see the mind, we can influence it, but we can't control it. We can, to a certain extent, we can just sit back and just watch the mind, and it just moves, and it's got its own agenda sometimes. And that's a fact. It's got its own conditioning, its own history. And sometimes you have to sit there and you watch it, and you can have this sort of insight that this isn't you. These thoughts are not you. Memories, they come and they go. Moods, they come and they go, and they change. We can be so convinced of something one moment, and it changes the next. The whole thing, it's not us. It doesn't belong to us. And while we certainly have to take responsibility for it on the level of actions, on a higher level, we can just put the whole thing down, and we are absolutely free. We don't have to pick it up at all. It simply is a process, and as it moves, as it changes, as it grows old, we don't have to be afraid of that. We don't have to be intimidated by that. And it dies, and we don't have to be afraid of that. So a positive attitude, I think, is something that we is a tool that we have to cultivate. And with these kind of different places where we get stuck, around the different moral battles that we have to battle with ourselves, we have to admit this. There's no getting around it, that we have to do battle. There's no progress to a certain extent, without fighting. But it's not like we're not in a situation where we're trying to the victories that we're going to have over ourselves aren't about pushing down and getting rid of the negative, but it's around understanding it. It's around it's got to be a matter of understanding it. If it's a matter of just pushing it away and trying to ignore it so that you can stick to the positive, that may work. You may kind of overcome some defilements temporarily, but it's going to resurface. And if you have the religious view that basically, all you have to do is just keep pushing it away, keep pushing it away, keep pushing it away, it's just going to keep coming back, and eventually it's got to be kind of understood. You got to recognize that basically these defilements, they lead to your harm. They lead to suffering. And it only makes sense for someone who sees that clearly. The defilements are something that should be abandoned, and they are abandoned through clear seeing. They're not abandoned through force. So this is just something to reflect on, using a positive perceptions to give us encouragement and energy to do battle not to push away the defilements, but to know that we can conquer them through sometimes pushing them away, but ultimately through investigating and understanding them and letting them go. So that's a few thoughts for this evening.